Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for that introduction. This is David Cooperman, and I will be giving an overview of the project overall. I'll be discussing how it came about, what its objectives were, and so forth. And Jesse Coleman will be focusing on the evaluation and monitoring that happened of the pilot project, and Victoria Press will be focusing on the public realm aspects of the project. So just a quick agenda to outline what we'll be going over in this presentation. So first, a quick overview of the King Street Transit pilot, what it was about, how it came about. Then some discussion of that evaluation and monitoring program with results, and then some time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. I will also be talking about sort of other operational changes that happened prior to the pilot that informed the actions that we took during the pilot project. So to give some context, the area in which this pilot project happened is actually the downtown core of Toronto. And I just want to highlight that the city of Toronto actually has been growing very quickly, and over 10 years, the population increased by 228,000 people. In the downtown, the core of the downtown, it's only 3% of the land in the city, but accounts for half of the GDP and a third of the employment. And the streetcar network, it's actually the second longest or second most extensive in the world, and has been in continuous operation since 1861 with the highest ridership in North America. And as you can see, over 95 million annual passengers. And it generally covers the downtown, east and west, and we're focusing on the actual busiest route there, the King Street route, right in the core. That includes the financial district. So why specifically did we choose King Street for a transit priority project? Well, there were many considerations, and one of them was, of course, just the very important location we were dealing with. So King Street is a major arterial road. It passes through the financial district of Toronto and the entertainment district. And it's right in the middle of a very large city and had 72,000 daily riders on the streetcar route, which also connects to 4 subway stations. So that was actually in 2017 before we launched the pilot project. We found many challenges for the streetcar service along King Street and throughout its route, and those included the fact that the streetcars were very well used, in fact overcrowded at many times, and very slow. There were actually many periods of the day during which walking was actually faster than taking the streetcar. And King Street also was a very busy corridor for vehicle use. The section that we're looking at in particular, between Bathurst Street in the west and Jervis Street in the east, carried about 20,000 vehicles per day. And we're also seeing very significant growth in generally along King Street, in particular in 2 neighborhoods in the west and the east. So these 2 photos just illustrate part of the challenge. So one issue was that the delays to streetcars were happening not just during traditional peak periods, so not just during rush hour when you would expect high traffic volumes and sort of everyone moving very slowly, including the streetcars. We also saw major challenges to their speed and their reliability during other periods of the day. So King Street is, as I mentioned, it passes through the entertainment district. It's a very busy part of the city that has a lot of special events, draws a lot of people in the evenings, on weekends. And so we were actually seeing a lot of this traffic, a lot of these delays, a lot of the poor service during those other periods that included the late evenings and the weekends. So you can see on the left is your typical peak period rush hour shot of the street, and on the right is actually a later evening photo that shows much the same situation for drivers and for transit as well. So the initiation of this pilot wasn't actually the first action that we had taken as a city or as the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission, the transit agency for our city. So actually there were many things that were done leading up to this this work we did on the pilot in 2016 and 2017. So by 2016, we had already implemented many changes, including time-based reserved lanes that showed the median lanes reserved for transit during certain periods of the day. That wasn't found to be very effective. It was very difficult to enforce and didn't make an appreciable difference to the transit service. Transit signal priority was installed. It had been previously installed many years prior, but we did a review and found that many of the locations weren't working or weren't working optimally, so they were repaired and improved. Also, there were extended periods implemented for turning, parking, and stopping. And so the peak periods were extended to 7 to 10 in the morning and 3 to 7 in the afternoon, generally no stopping end-to-end on King Street in the curb lane. Also, increased fines for those violations came together with those changes. And as you can see in the photo, we even, other operational changes included the installation of these LED illuminated signs that highlighted the turn prohibitions. So we knew that left turning vehicles were causing delays along the line, and to improve compliance and improve awareness of those restrictions, these illuminated signs were installed at key intersections. At the same time, the Toronto Transit Commission implemented all-door boarding and proof of payment fare collection, so it was possible to board streetcars at all doors. And the idea there was, of course, to reduce the dwell times, to improve the speed of boarding and alighting at stops. Some streetcar stops were removed or consolidated in order to optimize spacing and to improve operations, and schedules were changed. Buses were added during particular periods to improve service and capacity, and a new route was actually introduced, the 514 Cherry route along the central section of the King Street route. So it was actually essentially a branch of the larger route, but that was able to increase service just in the central portion throughout the core. Despite all of these measures, in 2016 and 2017, we were finding that there was still an issue with unreliable service, with significant delays, and in general, with moving people on King Street through the corridor. We weren't getting the reliability or the capacity that we wanted. And through discussions between both the city and the Toronto Transit Commission, we decided that we wanted to try something bigger on this corridor, and that's how the idea of a pilot project first came about. So at the same time that we were discussing these ideas and coming up with a concept and then a design for the pilot project, there was also a parallel modeling study that was happening. So we used this as an opportunity to develop a model essentially of the downtown, and that included micro simulation, because we really wanted a much better idea of sort of how people were moving in the downtown and by all different modes, and sort of how operational changes on one street could impact the network overall. And so this was an opportunity not so much just to test things out for King Street, because we knew we would be trying things out on the ground, actually on the street, and seeing the results almost instantly. It was also an opportunity to sort of develop that broader downtown model and to actually calibrate it to existing conditions. And so we would take the opportunity later to calibrate it to the new conditions on King Street, and that would sort of take into account how the rest of the downtown network was impacted.
So before the pilot was implemented, the streetcars operated in mixed traffic with regular vehicles integrated within these streets. Streetcars were slowed down with left turns. Transit passengers had to cross the live traffic lanes to board the streetcars. Cyclists navigated between on-street parking and various congestion in the roadway. Sidewalks were, jammed on both sides of the street. King Street is a very high area for pedestrian traffic as well. And then also there was very limited spaces for other types of curb lane uses outside of on-street parking, which includes taxi stands, areas for commercial and passenger loading, accessible loading zones, and making deliveries. So community engagement is has always and will continue to be an extremely important part of King Street and the Transit Priority Corridor. It started many years before the pilot actually began, with engagement related to the City Planning Division's downtown plan, TO Core. From there, the King Street Visioning Study was launched, and that involved a significant amount of diverse community engagement, including public meetings, letter drops, workshops, talking to people on the streets, getting people involved online as well, with very high response rates. It was very clear that many people felt very strongly about the need for something to be done on King Street. We also set up a project website, and this was very important, not only leading up to the pilot, but during the pilot. We basically had an open door model where we welcomed any sort of feedback to our general King Street pilot email accounts, and we were able to work on a case-by-case basis with people that reached out to us with questions, comments, or concerns.
So in terms of the actual design of the street and what actually changed with the pilot, what we essentially did was we turned a section of King Street into a local traffic only transit priority section. So essentially we created a series of what we called right turn loops. So through traffic could either use parallel east-west routes, and we picked a section of the downtown road network that actually had generally 5 parallel routes to King Street that could be used by vehicles instead. And on King Street itself, it meant that through traffic was very limited, and essentially it was a local traffic continued to be permitted. And at most intersections, most traffic would have to turn right. So that meant basically implementing a through movement ban for most vehicles at a majority of the intersections, so they couldn't travel all the way through. So as you can see from the diagram, this is a typical setup. This is part of the pilot section, and you can see that there's a through restriction and a left turn restriction at the signalized intersections. And also streetcar stops at the same time were moved for most locations from the near side before the traffic lights to the far side of the intersection. And that was done for a couple of reasons. So one of them was knowing that we would have some right turning traffic generated by this new design and the new restrictions. It was a way to facilitate that right turning traffic and to sort of reduce the conflict between the turning traffic and the transit stop. And the other main advantage of doing this was we were able to move the transit stops, the streetcar stops, from the sidewalk essentially to the curb lane. So we essentially bumped out and created a transit platform in the repurposed curb lane. And what that allows for is more direct boarding of the streetcars. So passengers no longer have to wait on the sidewalk and cross a traffic lane to board the streetcar. They are already at the platform, which is in the new repurposed curb lane, and can board more directly that way. So the design was meant to address at least two of the major sources of delay. So congestion was reduced by restricting traffic to local traffic only, and dwell times at stops. The aim was to reduce those to have quicker boarding by having this more direct boarding. So what that also did was it allowed for repurposing of the rest of the curb lane. So transit stops would use part of the curb lane, but the other spaces could be used for a variety of purposes. So those include taxi stands, which now could be used 24 hours a day, not just during certain periods, and loading zones, both commercial for goods delivery and for passenger loading as well. So those are indicated, the blue spaces in the diagram. The pink spaces, dedicated accessible loading. So these spaces could be used by vehicles with an accessible parking placard. So that could be our paratransit service or accessible taxis or anyone else sort of with need. And the green indicates new public spaces that were used for a variety of purposes, which we'll get into later in the presentation. I would also just add that there are some exemptions to the through restriction. So one of them, aside from the very obvious one for transit vehicles, streetcars can go through. The other ones include cyclists. Cyclists could travel through all the intersections. And generally, the other exceptions are maintenance and emergency vehicles. So there are a few considerations in coming up with this design that I'll just call functional considerations. So one of them was, as I mentioned, we were maintaining local traffic access, recognizing that a lot of the buildings on King Street only have their access off King Street and don't have a separate access off a side street. We knew that that had to be maintained, at least for off-street parking access and for deliveries. That was one important consideration. I mentioned also the accessible loading space because all of those vehicles before the pilot could use any parking space for that purpose, and we took on-street parking off the street as a replacement, and to make sure that there was still good accessible loading access to buildings throughout King Street. We added dedicated loading spaces pretty much on each block of the street. We also wanted to make sure that traffic volumes, we looked at traffic volumes throughout the downtown road network. We wanted to make sure that given some level of diversion to other streets, those volumes could still be accommodated within the broader downtown road network, and we found that the impacts would be acceptable. And we also looked at sort of estimating what would actually happen to the traffic volumes on King Street itself with the proposed restrictions, and estimated that based on the data that we had on local and through trips, that we would decrease through traffic or total traffic volumes on King Street by at least 50%. We actually found in most cases it ended up being higher than that, but that was the estimate that we had before we undertook the pilot. And we also undertook some additional data collection before the pilot, including counts of traffic using driveways and curbside activity, deliveries and stopping and other curbside activity. And as I mentioned, removed street parking from the street. So implementing the pilot removed approximately 180 spaces from the street. These were not 24-hour parking spaces. They were only during off-peak hours. Additionally, it's worth mentioning that within about a 5-minute walk of King Street, there are at least 8,000 parking spaces. So we considered that as well. And throughout the pilot, we actually were able to add some parking spaces back onto side streets as well.
So when the pilot got approval from council, the report proposed 3 fundamental pillars through which the pilot would be assessed. One would be improving transit efficiency, one would be increasing economic development, and then the third would be enhancing the public realm. So this is a really important component of the pilot because it does help with the other 2 pillars as well. And giving more room, giving the curb lane space for pedestrian use, for alternative use than vehicles, really did give a great opportunity to implement some really excellent public realm interventions, including many parklets, different public art pieces, road murals, and other types of initiatives like mini art galleries. It gave us the opportunity to implement our bike share stations on the curb lane instead of taking up sidewalk space. And it's also importantly allowed opportunities for businesses to set out large patio spaces in the front of the in the curb lane in front of their businesses. And in the last summer in the pilot year, we did have 9 licensed business cafes and 2 private seating areas that were funded by local businesses. So this was a really awesome opportunity for community placemaking, getting artists, students, designers involved in this process, and really sort of emphasizing the other benefits of what implementing a transit priority corridor can look like. Importantly, it also allowed us to more or less test and observe mini pilots within the larger pilot, meaning we were able to observe how different materials lasted throughout the pilot period. Look at the different ways in which people took to sitting in different areas. What was the public life like in these different spaces, and how did the design of these seating areas or public art pieces influence that? And so that's really invaluable information that we are now taking on with us as we're looking towards the next steps. So if you, for more information about the pilot and the layout, you can visit toronto.ca/King Street Pilot. This picture here is just showing me what I call the basic essentials layout of the pilot, where our streetcar stops have a vinyl wrapped jersey barrier, tactile strips, a planter, and an accessibility ramp. One of the main features of the pilot is that all of the materials that we used to build out were flexible and temporary. And so this allowed us to, in many situations, adjust on the fly and be really responsive with the feedback that we were hearing, as well as, make quick changes when needed.
Great. Hi, everyone. This is Jesse. I've been sitting here quietly for a bit, so my turn to talk a little bit, I guess. So my team is essentially a data analytics team within the transportation division here, and we got brought into the fold on this project essentially right after the pilot got passed by City Council. So the timeline was sort of beginning of July of 2017, I guess, and we were asked to sort of help out with a bunch of groups, including a lot of people at the TTC as well, to come up with a monitoring and evaluation plan and strategy for the pilot. From the outset, we knew that this project was going to be highly controversial. There were going to be a lot of eyes on it, and sort of from the experience of some recent, high-profile projects we'd had in our division, most notably around some big bike lane projects. The Bloor Street bike lanes pilot was one of the ones that was kind of a precursor to this. We knew there was just going to be extensive demand for data and for analysis sort of as we went along this project. So sort of with that in mind, we started putting together a plan and implementing that plan to collect data during the pilot. So this slide just sort of shows you all of the elements of the project that needed data on and that we wanted to evaluate and monitor. So the themes of the project initially, and as we continue through, were these three themes of: one, moving people more efficiently on transit; the second was supporting business and economic prosperity; and the third was improving public space. So throughout the course of the pilot, us or other groups within our divisions or city planning or TTC collected data on just about all of these elements. Over the next few slides, I'll focus a lot on the sort of first and second columns here, which is really around the transit service, reliability, speed, capacity, the impact on walking and cycling, the impact on traffic in the surrounding neighborhood, as well as the impact on sort of economic impact on surrounding businesses. So one of the things that we thought we would do, and Victoria talked earlier about this idea of a mini pilot within a pilot, and we kind of took this approach in a lot of ways to the data collection as well. We felt like we had an opportunity to try to do some things a little bit more differently, and we had sort of a unique set of challenges right from the outset, where we just knew that the amount of data that we have to collect regularly through the pilot was very extensive. So this slide here just sort of contrasts what we call the traditional versus the modern approach to monitoring. So the way that these projects are done typically, and even a few years ago, this is kind of the only way that we could have done it, is really to rely very heavily on manual data collection. So you can sort of picture, if we needed to collect data every month and report on this every month, we'd be going out there and doing traffic counts every month. We'd be going out there and doing travel time studies. We'd be collecting data on the streetcars in terms of their travel times, their ridership, their reliability, et cetera. And a lot of this would be sort of manual, boots on the ground counting and data collection. There's a lot of issues with that, and we've faced a lot of them as a transportation division before. One is that it's really expensive, especially when you're trying to do this over the course of a year and you're trying to collect data every month. It's expensive to get contractors and staff out there counting all the time. There's also issues with low sample sizes. You know, you can get up there on a weird day. It can be a funny rainy day, or there could be some event that's happening, and you start collecting data, and it's just not representative of what's happening there. And that sort of ties into this problem where it becomes really easy to make mistakes. You know, on the staff side, what ends up happening is you get these sort of reams of spreadsheets that are coming in from all these different contractors. And it's just really easy to miss things, to get stuff disorganized, and to make mistakes in analysis, which ends up kind of undermining some of the findings in the analysis that you have. And then sort of a perception that ends up coming through all this, and we've seen this in previous projects where, you know, we're very much under the microscope of the media in Toronto, and you know, it becomes really slow to go from data collection to putting information out to communicating findings. And so that creates other, you know, sort of dialogues around, you know, is the city being transparent? Are they being objective? Are they cooking the numbers behind the scene? So there's just a lot of issues with that approach. So what we really wanted to do with this project was to build pervasive and permanent data collection capabilities that were just able to use these kind of new generations of sensing technologies to just collect data as much as we could all the time. And you know, we made the business case for this as well, where we're pretty easily able to show that you could take the same money that you would spend on manual traffic counts and travel time studies and all this stuff, and spend that money on some sensor technologies, which I'll get into in the next slides. But you know, in that money turns into an investment that actually builds your agency's data capacity and capability. You know, where my team came in as well is that we sort of have this in-house data science capability where we're able to build some of the pipelines and the automated processes to take this data and make it sort of push button ready to go from a feed of data coming into a report. And then what we ended up doing is then taking the data and the outputs of this and shared it openly and actively through our open data portal, and as well through sort of these public dashboard reports that we're putting out monthly or bi-monthly throughout the course of the pilot.
So I would add just one point. I want to clarify that we did make use prior to coming up with the design and prior to launching the pilot, we did a fair amount of manual data collection as well. In fact, it was a combination of manual and automated data collection. So we wanted to identify the causes of the unreliable service and the delays to the streetcars. And that required definitely having people out in the field at stops riding the streetcars in combination with the use of an iPhone app that was used to aid in classifying the delays. And then we used the data gathered that way to identify the major causes, and that informed the design of the pilot. So when we saw how much of the unreliability and how much of the delay time was caused by traffic congestion, by signal delays, by boarding, and curbside activity, that helped us to design the pilot. But once we were at that stage, it became much more practical and much more economical to take this more modern approach with the new technologies available.
Yeah, and I think there's always a fine balance too of like there's some stuff that you can collect data on easily with more modern automatic approaches. There's also a lot of the more detailed, like the stuff that David describes of, you know, operational level queuing, delay studies. A lot of that stuff is really hard to do automatically right now. So it's good to like spend your data collection effort on that stuff and try to automate the stuff that's easy. So there's really three parts of it. So I'm focusing in on a couple technologies here that we use to monitor really what the impact was on traffic and on pedestrians and bicycles in the neighborhood. You know, the other big element of this that isn't on these next couple of slides is that, you know, the TTC already had data capabilities set up that they were able to process the GPS traces that were coming from their streetcar fleet to measure all of the data around travel time and reliability of their streetcars, which was, you know, probably number one thing that needed to be measured out of this whole thing. So we were sort of asked to answer a few basic questions, you know, really what was the impact on traffic in the surrounding areas? Was it increasing traffic congestion on parallel streets? Whether more or less pedestrians in the area, what were the impacts on bicycles? So the first piece of technology that we ended up installing was sort of automatic video-based counting system. And this was from a vendor called MyoVision. And what we ended up doing was we installed at the 31 intersections, I believe it was, in that map below. It was a combination of a 360-degree camera at each intersection, as well as a video analytics unit that was mounted in the traffic signal cabinet. And what this system does is it processes the video in real time and converts it to count data. And it's able to classify turning movements by pedestrians, bicycles, cars, trucks, and transit. There were some issues with this technology through the pilot. So instead of relying as much on the sort of permanent 24/7 capability of this thing, we ended up sort of having to do it a little bit more after the fact by recording some video off of the system and QCing it a little bit more heavily. But it's a system that has a lot of potential and that we're quite bullish on. And then the next sort of, I guess, yeah, we'll go to the next one. David already covered some of the other stuff. Oh, so you can sort of see the video on the bottom there that kind of shows it in action with such vehicles being classified and tracked through the intersection. And I think, and then the next piece of technology that we relied on really heavily was used to track the travel times of cars on all of the corridors parallel to King Street. And Bluetooth readers are a technology that's used more and more in transportation agencies around the world. And essentially, they're very simple technology that is just you put a sensor at an intersection at strategic locations, and what they do is they sort of sniff around for devices that are Bluetooth enabled near that intersection, and they're able to sort of see a unique identifier of that device, and then when that same device passes another intersection with a reader in it, they're able to match them up and get a travel time from point A to point B. There's some privacy protections that get put in there that scramble the MAC addresses, so you can never trace it back to an individual. But it's really nice technology, and it's pretty simple, and it works well. So we had about 54, I think, detectors now in downtown Toronto, and we were able to take that to track on a daily and hourly basis what the travel times were on different streets downtown. So this slide just sort of talks a little bit about all of the different types of data that ended up being collected through the study. So on the transit side, there was ridership data, there was travel time data, and reliability data. So the ridership data was generally manually collected and supplemented with smart card data from the Presto system, and then travel time reliability data came from GPS. Car travel times were from Bluetooth, and volumes were from the camera system. Pedestrian and cyclist counts were from the camera system. The causes of delay are some of the studies that David were mentioning, which were manual collection. Parking utilization and revenue was collected by the parking authority. Curbside activity was more manual studies. The University of Toronto also was working on a research study to look at the impact of the pilot on air quality and noise levels. And so they actually deployed some different air quality sensors throughout the downtown area with some interesting results. Collisions came from our police data feeds. Customer spending was through data from a point of sale device company, Moneris, and public realm was measured through experience, environmental, and mobility perception surveys. So lots and lots of data collection. So I'll just touch briefly on the results. We're happy to answer some more questions about this as well. So all of the results to this study are available on the website. So essentially I'll be walking you through some slides which are examples of this is sort of the annual summary report or data dashboard that we called it. All of these things are available on the website. We are publishing these monthly or bi-monthly throughout the course of the pilot as well. So this was sort of the highlight page that's at the front. And then, the next slide gets into some of the transit statistics. Actually, just stayed on the last one, yeah. So, one of the main findings that we saw throughout the pilot was that the travel times and reliability of streetcars through the pilot area was improved dramatically. There were sort of 5-ish minute improvements for both eastbound and westbound travel times in both peak periods. Larger improvements in the PM peak period where the conditions were worse than the AM peak period to begin with. And one of the real takeaways that we found was that you're not just interested in the average travel times when you're looking at this stuff. What really matters is how is the bad trips impacted? How are the the once or twice a month where you have really unreliable service or your bad weeks, how are those impacted? And sort of what we ended up seeing in a lot of cases was that the worst days, the sort of 95th percentile travel times ended up being almost equivalent to what the average travel times were before the pilot started.
So also a subset of the data on transit relates to the capacity actually delivered. So we were very interested in whether we could, to say that we were moving people more effectively and more efficiently along King Street, we wanted to be able to demonstrate that in a few different ways. And one of them is a measure that the Transit Commission actually uses, and that is hourly capacity delivered. So how many people can they actually move on their vehicles, on the streetcars, each hour in each direction? And throughout the pilot, you can see from these two graphs, the morning and the afternoon look a little bit different, but in both cases, there's a very significant increase. So ridership increased significantly throughout the pilot, and in order to meet that throughout the pilot, we were actually adding streetcars into service. So additional streetcars were being put on the street, and at the same time, an older fleet of streetcars was being replaced with a newer, higher capacity fleet. So you can see the note on the graph says low floor streetcars introduced on 504 King, and toward the end, it's actually full low floor service on 504 King. So those new streetcars were actually able to carry more people and to absorb that very significant increase in ridership. It actually went from 72,000 riders per day to 84,000 riders per day. And if you look at the hour by hour figures, you can actually see that in the peak morning hour, capacity was increased from basically around 2,000, near 2,000 passengers per hour per direction to very close to 3,000. So on a regular basis, we are now carrying close to 3,000 people per hour per direction on streetcars, which is a very significant increase. In the afternoon, ridership is not quite as high, and so the regular delivered capacity doesn't need to be that high, but you can see that it also increased significantly. You can see from about the 1,500 range to close to 2,500 people per hour per direction.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're able to measure, which is pretty neat, at a couple screen lines or sort of east-west streets, was just the total person throughput across sort of a series of streets from Queen Street south to Front Street. So we're able to look at, there's obviously fewer cars that are passing through King Street as the capacity was brought down there, but then we knew there was also an increase in ridership on the streetcars as well. So, essentially what we're able to show is that, from the pre-pilot to through the pilot period, there was a total increase of about 3,000 people that were able to push through that corridor. So even with essentially restricting one of the major east-west, 1 out of 6 of the major east-west arterials to, local street level capacity, we're still actually able to increase the number of people that were being pushed through the corridor. And I'll just quickly touch on some of the highlights of this so we can get on to the next sections and take time for questions at the end. So traffic volumes, essentially what ended up happening is, David mentioned earlier that some of the initial modeling was estimating that there'd be a drop of about 50% in vehicle volumes on King Street. What ended up happening was that the decrease was anywhere from about 65% to 90%. So very significant decreases in traffic volumes, which was really great for keeping the operation of streetcars smooth on that street. A lot of those those volumes sort of ended up getting pushed to some of the east-west parallel streets. So, a number of the streets, sort of increased 5 to 10% generally in volumes. Some different outliers depending on different traffic conditions and stuff on those. But generally, sort of like 5 to 10% increase in volumes on the parallel streets. And that sort of asks the next question, which is, was there an impact from those increases on travel times, or was there enough capacity in the road network to absorb that? And essentially what we saw was that broadly there was enough capacity to hold it. We saw, this slide is just showing the changes in travel times for cars on the east-west streets. You can see that, generally the impacts are pretty minimal. Depending on which period you looked at, generally there's increases of about half a minute in travel time on a lot of these arterials from Bathurst to Jarvis. Some of them actually went down over that same period. So, it all kind of kept in that sort of plus or minus a minute range. So nothing that we felt was particularly significant. In terms of pedestrian volumes, we were essentially just tracking this to see if there was any major impacts on pedestrian flow. And, to be honest, we didn't see a lot. And pedestrian counts are a funny one to track because they're very heavily influenced by seasonality as well. The next slide looks at cyclist volumes. And one of the interesting things was that, even though we didn't design specifically for cyclists on this corridor, it definitely ended up being a street that was a lot more popular for cyclists to ride down, just because there was very little car traffic nearby. So, we saw some pretty significant increase in cyclist numbers on King Street. It sort of became the second busiest or second most popular cycling route in downtown Toronto, east-west. Richmond and Adelaide, for those who don't know, they have dedicated cycle tracks on both Richmond and Adelaide, one in the eastbound direction, one in the westbound. They're one-way pairs. So after those streets, King Street was sort of the next most popular street. And then the last one was that we were, one of the hottest topics of this project was what was the impact going to be on local businesses. And there's a lot of outcry from a set of them off the beginning of the project. So we really needed to track what was the year-over-year growth like in sales. And that's where we sort of brought on Moneris as a partner of this to provide us some data. And, you can read the report on this as well, but the long story short is this data is pretty tricky and noisy to pick signal from noise out of, but we didn't really see a lot of impact. If you look at the top of there, this is restaurant-specific spending, and you can sort of squint your eyes and see that before there was year-over-year increases, and after there was a slight decrease. But then at the same time, you're seeing increases in retail spending and increases in service spending, and there just wasn't enough in this data to be able to really point your fingers as any of these changes being directly attributed to the pilot project as opposed to other economic trends in the area. So I guess the other point in the restaurant spending is that while the year-over-year change has gone down on King Street, it also similarly went down in the surrounding areas and the rest of Toronto as control samples. So it's hard to know what causes these things.
Okay, so very quickly, I'll also just mention some of the changes that we made to the design and operations throughout the pilot, because we did say when we took the report to council that we would monitor and respond based on data collected and requests received. And so we made changes to signal timing. In some cases, it was to improve signal coordination across several intersections. In other cases, it was transit signal priority. So I mentioned that we tried transit signal priority before. We actually deactivated it while the new traffic patterns were getting established, and then developed new optimized signal timings for all the intersections. And that included the reactivation of transit signal priority and its upgrade with various scripts, including one that prevented repeat calls with closely spaced streetcars. But we actually found that to work quite effectively after it was activated and upgraded. Also, we had a right turn arrow phase that was added at most intersections to accommodate the right turning traffic we expected. With lower observed volumes, we actually were able to shorten that phase and use the green time for other movements. And at one intersection, there was some diverted traffic that was forming a queue northbound and approaching a parallel street to King. So at that intersection, we were actually able to add a right turn lane and a green arrow to better move that traffic through the intersection and avoid impacts on others. And we also added and adjusted many of the loading zones and public realm spaces throughout the pilot. And this was in response to the actual data that we collected in the field on curbside use, and also requests from the businesses and from others for those spaces. And we're able to add some parking spaces to side streets. So for enforcement, I'll just say that we worked very closely and actively with our partners at the Toronto Police Service. And we had an education and awareness campaign before the pilot launched, so everyone was aware of the new restrictions and the design changes to King Street. And throughout the course of the pilot, of the monitoring period, actually about 10,000 traffic tickets were issued for violations of the new restrictions. And those were supplemented with dedicated enforcement blitzes from time to time, but also just it was part of the regular patrols through the area as well. There were changes to the streetcar routes. I mentioned the 514 Cherry before. That was kind of the central portion of the route that was created as a separate route. That was actually changed back later to the configuration you see on the screen here, which was found to serve most travel patterns better. So it actually split the route that goes from a subway station in the west through the downtown and back up to a subway station in the east. The route was actually redesigned, so it was split into two branches with an overlap through the downtown, which is essentially the King pilot area.
Okay, so in April, City Council voted to make King Street a permanent transit priority corridor. And so I'm just going to quickly talk about what's next for the next few years. The interim build-out phase is where we currently are now, which basically means we are, the TTC is planning for track replacement in 2023. So we have a sort of interim stopgap implementation opportunity to build out some more durable pieces of the public realm before we go into a capital project on King Street. The interim build-out first sort of begins with, we went back to the businesses, the stakeholders, and asked them about their curb lane needs and what they wanted to see in front of their business. And from there, we developed a draft detailed design for what would eventually become the full build out there. In addition to public realm and infrastructure elements, the TTC is also continuing to look at efficiencies in how to increase service and make sure that we continue to increase ridership on this route. That looks like expanding transit stop areas, potentially incorporating buses into the flow there, and so it's continual work trying to keep making King Street better for everyone. We have a considerable uptake in the number of patios that will likely come out onto the street this year, which is quite exciting. We're looking at more durable public realm elements. This is an example of a sidewalk extension that we're looking to add in considerable pinch point areas. Enhancing transit stops with more durable infrastructure, getting people raised to the sidewalk grade. And then we will soon start the conversation about what does the full streetscape revitalization look like, and how can we incorporate this complete streets approach into a construction project. So the last couple of slides are just examples of transit priority streets and infrastructure pieces that we have here in Toronto. This is an example in Melbourne, Australia, and San Francisco.